We are living in a time where hate has become louder, where words are fueling division, and where fear and violence are entering our streets, schools, homes, and places of worship. Every day, people are being targeted because of their faith, race, culture, or simply because they are different. But we refuse to allow hate to define our future. This series is about more than hate crimes. It is about humanity, healing, understanding, and courageous conversations that bring people together instead of tearing them apart. Featuring faith leaders, community advocates, public officials, survivors, and voices from different backgrounds, united in confronting hate and building hope. Because love must speak louder than hate, and our shared humanity must always rise above division. Join us for this powerful new series on the SB Life Institute podcast, Conversations on Hate, Healing, Unity, and Hope. Coming soon.
Greetings and peace and love be with you all, and welcome to another edition of SB Life Institute podcast. I'm your host, Safraz Bacchus, and today I am very honored to join by someone quite amazing, Kylie Madhav. She's our guest today as we continue to discuss about hate crime, and we will talk a little bit more about that. Just to introduce our guest, Kylie is a campaign consultant who has helped shape the political strategy of several successful progressive candidates in New York. She has worked extensively with the immigrants and the LGBTQ communities in New York, the Dominican Republic, and Mumbai, India. She also holds an MBA from the Yale School of Management, as well as a Master of Social Work and degree in Linguistics and Law and Society from New York University. Kylie, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm truly honored and pleased that you take time from your busy schedule to join us on this podcast. To commence, I would like to begin learning a little bit more from you and about you. I know we have connected in various events that they had that surrounds hate crime and other events. But, I would like to start off with you to tell me about your journey and what inspired you to pursue a career in politics and also in advocacy and community engagement. And that will be a great point for us to start our discourse.
Oh, thank you so much, Sheikh. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to say, Malai Vanakkam, good evening to everyone out there in the audience. So my journey into sort of advocacy and politics, really, I would say it probably started with my mom. I grew up with a single mother on the south side of Chicago many years ago. And she is someone who was not particularly, dogmatic in any particular direction, but she was
Yes.
someone that had a very deep sense of justice and equality, and it doesn't matter the sort of divisions that people might use to label themselves,
Yes.
that everybody, irrespective of their background, is deserving of equal treatment and equal access to opportunity. So that was just something that I was raised with a very strong sense of from my mother, who grew up she actually grew up in New York City, in Queens, in South Ozone Park.
Yeah.
But we have family, especially back then, who were in the South, in the Jim Crow South, right? So when she was going, she is a Black woman, she's a multiracial Black woman, but when she was going down South back in the 1960s, this was the time of Jim Crow. So she remembers the sort of like, white only entrances and the Black only entrances. And so, obviously that ended legally many years ago, but that was, part of her formative years. And so when she had children in the 80s, like I think that, the sort like an abhorrence to that sort of iniquity was something that she very much took pains to instill in me and my younger brother. So that was just sort of like the base in which I grew up. And then obviously I moved to New York for undergraduate at the age of 18. I came back to my mother's hometown, from Chicago. And I started off pretty much immediately working in organizing and social justice spaces. So my very first job was as an interpreter at the unfortunately now defunct Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture. This was a program that existed for many years, for decades,
Yeah.
supporting people who were seeking asylum from various parts of the world. So when I was there, because I speak French and Spanish and Haitian Creole fluently, I was primarily working with people who were from French-speaking West Africa and occasionally from Haiti who were seeking asylum because of having been persecuted for various reasons in their home country. It was mostly political persecution. Sometimes it was gender-based. Sometimes it was about being LGBT. Sometimes it was about religion. But it didn't matter. Like, the end result was the same. So that was my first job, as a teenager into my very early 20s. And again, so I had the base that I grew up with, like from my mother. And then, I'm coming and doing this work and I'm seeing again, just like the absurdity of like, because of a person's political beliefs, for example, that we're gonna, run them out of their hometown and run them out of their country, mistreat them and do just unspeakably cruel things to them. And it was just always so illogical to me. It was something that I used to think about a lot is like, what could motivate a person to mistreat someone right in front of them because of an idea, because of a political party or whatever it is. And it just never made sense to me. And I think, I spent the next phases of my career essentially trying to do what I could to you know, idealistically rid the society that I live in, that we live in New York
Yeah.
City and the United States, of that mentality that I saw ruin or, attempt to ruin so many different lives from these countries of people that I used to work with. And so, from being an interpreter, that led me to pursue an MSW and an MBA, and I worked as a therapist for many years. I also worked in management at various sort of like social justice agencies, and I'm very honored to have had the career that I had in that space. And I think,
Yeah.
as we've seen over the last decade, our politics has pivoted in this country so far to the right, right? Like, so when I started out in my career, it was like, like we obviously had our issues. It was the Bush era, like when I started out in my 20s. But, then we had the Obama era and things seemed that they were going in the right direction. And then our country
Everything
took a very
changed after that.
everything changed after 2016. Like we took a very
Yeah.
hard pivot to the right.
Yeah.
And that is when I decided to get more expressly involved in politics, because I think that politics is not the only solution to the injustice in our society, but it is a powerful tool. It is a powerful lever of, influence in our society. So I wanted to get more directly involved in supporting the left, specifically the socialist left. And that is what led me to supporting the campaigns that I've supported, and
Yeah.
to joining DSA and getting involved more explicitly in leftist political work.
So thank you so much. Listening to you and you talking about y- uh, your mom growing up in a particular era when it was quite challenging for her as a person of color, having to navigate all of that hate and segregation. I'm sure that those positive values was instilled in you by your mom, and you also learned about her struggles. And definitely, when we hear the stories from our parents and we know what they went through, we would not want our generation to go through that. So, can you say your mom somehow influenced you as well, and also your life experiences? I'm hearing from what you were saying, also somehow a motivation for you as well.
Absolutely.
So the the other thing I would like to probably ask, that you have worked with immigrant communities, you mentioned, and
Mm.
the LGBT communities and the political campaigns across different countries and culture. You know, how challenging is this work for you, especially having to advocate in this time for the rights of the LGBT communities and also the immigrants, right? I'm
Yes.
sure you experience a lot of hate. I will love to hear your stories, and also um, uh, if you can share about your work, having to have certain experiences that I know that you probably had experience, and how is that able to somehow push you towards, motivate you towards continue doing the work?
Yes. So I think for me, I'll sort of start off by answering the sort of last part of your question first about like
Yeah,
the motivation and then like get into some
yeah,
of the
yeah,
challenges. But, you know, when I was working as an interpreter, again, as primarily from people from West Africa who spoke French or from Haiti who spoke French or Creole, um, you know, the stories were heavy, right? Like, you know, so, you know, they're describing to you the worst day or week or month or whatever of their lives, right? Like, you know, because that was the point of our interaction. Like, you know, I was interpreting their stories for the purpose of their asylum cases, right? So
yeah.
we're preparing a court case. And they were heavy, right? Like, you know, like as someone who grew up in Chicago in this country, like, you know, I had no experience of like, you know, that level of persecution was just not something I had ever experienced or have ever experienced. Like that was a different level. And I remember, you know, what struck me most about working with the people that I had the honor of working with is that even though they had experienced things I would argue most human beings couldn't even imagine, they were filled with this sense of hope that was
Yeah.
palpable. Like they, you know, the people I worked with you know, were mostly not, you know, people who presented as, you know, dejected, you know, oh, I've given up on life, you know, I'm in a new country now.
Yeah,
Like, you know, I have to learn English and I don't understand anybody around me, you know, like they had all of these challenges in front of them and they remained so hopeful for the future, if that makes sense.
steadfast.
Steadfast, like, they didn't give up, and I think that really is the thing that I've taken with me because 'cause it's been nearly 20 years since I did that work, and I've never
20
forgotten, you know.
years you spent. Yeah,
Yeah, well, 20 years ago, so I spent about probably 3 to 4 years, like, doing this work, but that was about 20 years ago,
years
like, when
ago.
I was in my 20s.
Okay.
Um, and so, you know, but these people, again, like, they were just so resilient and so like, they had so much hope for the future, and I think that's something that I took with me is that, like, even when a person is experiencing difficulties or persecution, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, that's the end of their story or that their story is like, you know, that they can achieve, like, whatever it is that they want to achieve in life. And so to answer your question, yes, there are many difficult days, like, doing this work that especially, you know, currently, right? You know, I think for me, one of the saddest things about doing the work I'm doing now is that, you know, 10 years ago when I had a client, you know, I could tell them, I know that you had a difficult moment in your country of origin, but now you're in the United States and things are going to get better. Like, you know, we're not a perfect country, but
Yeah, that
we
that
are.
that one.
Well,
No,
exactly. It's like
now,
I could say,
now,
well,
now, now, that story is definitely is not one to
it's
say
not true
now
anymore.
because
Exactly.
uh,
It's like I
you
like
know,
it's so sad because I can't tell them anymore. Well,
unfortunately, having conversations with many, there are many that are actually sane because of these experiences that
yes.
you know the name before growing up. I'll say this: when I was growing up, you always was so fascinated about the United States. You always want to be
Mhm,
here, want to be,
mhm.
to visit. Now
Yep.
there are many who actually, for some reason, do not feel that connection. They have that love, but do not feel that they're wanted, so to speak.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, I hear you. Frankly speaking, I hear exactly what you're saying, and many communities that we interacted right often feel unheard, underrepresented, as you know. And from your experience, what does meaningful representation actually really looks like when we
Mm,
advocate for meaningful representation across the spectrum? Because
yes.
many seems to basically divide our community based on our orientation, religious values, color, gender. When we talk about meaningful representation, what does that look like for you?
So I think for me, representation, I fully believed, yes, like, you know, as many people as possible from as many different backgrounds as possible should be represented in the halls of power, like point blank. But I think meaningful representation for me is not just about the sort of like phenotypic diversity or sort of like this like checkbox like diversity
Check
like oh
boxes,
we
yeah.
have right it's like we have someone from X background therefore work like the work is done because as we've seen right you know especially now in America many agents of the far right you know are every color of the rainbow like we have people who are of you know Caribbean background, you know, African American background, Indian American background, who are all who did support the far right and who still support the far right. So it's not
Yeah.
enough for us to just have like a plurality of people who are at the table, we also have to have people that have a certain understanding that like, you know, for example, if I'm the first in my community to make it to a certain level, that's great and that matters, but you should be doing whatever you can within your power to make sure that you're not the last. So for me, meaningful representation is not just the presence of someone of a given background, it's the presence of someone with a given background who has a certain political understanding that we need to be, you know, taking down the barriers that have held people like them out of power. Right. So that's how I would define sort of like what meaningful representation looks like.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts where that is concerned. One of the things that we see in the sphere of power as a community leader, religious leader, and also yourself being an an advocate for peace and community leader to some extent as well. We will agree that elected official um, has to do a little bit more to combat these challenges that we're facing when it comes to hate crime and the
Yeah.
surge that we are seeing. They have to
Mm-hmm.
move beyond simple talking about what diversity looks like and actually builds trust with communities that they serve. Because when we're seeing in our communities, um, you know, politicians are using words that divides rather than bringing people together, it's concerning to us. And I often say this in many of my discourses. I often ask myself the question that if we do not do the work that we do and move beyond the walls of our little community that we have, move beyond that and do the work, question is what society, what community we live in for the generation to come, the kids to come. What
Absolutely.
are we doing? You were motivated listening to your story by your mom and what she experienced. Would you want that for your family?
That's right.
No, definitely not. So you will work extensively hard to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that what your mother experienced, that you do not experience the same, but you fight for yourself and also fight for tomorrow, for your
Absolutely.
generation, through
Yes.
education and whatever means. Can we talk a little bit about that? How can elected officials move beyond simply talking about matters like diversity or matters like inclusion? More, what more can they do? I mean, because I'm seeing that they're not doing anything more. They're
Right.
not
I
doing
mean,
anything. They're not doing sufficient, I will say.
agreed. I mean, I think right now one of the biggest challenges to change, or one of the biggest hurdles to change in this country, is that we have an elected class that is more concerned with decorum, and appearances and sort of like insider dealing than with
Mm,
actually disrupting the mechanisms of the far right. Like, for example, you know, you and I were present at a protest against the vile, you know, Islamophobic rhetoric of
yes,
a city council person here in New York
yes,
City. And
yes,
that city council person, that was not the first time that she said what she said. That was, you know,
yes.
she's not the only one who has said
It's a
those.
repeat
It's repeat
offense.
offense. And yet, based on the reaction of our local elected officials in the biggest city in America, you know, a very democratic blue city, I would argue that the vast majority of New Yorkers have no idea about that because our elected officials have been mostly quiet, and maybe they don't like what she said, but they're not doing anything publicly to exact a cost or a price for what she said, right? Like, I think until, you know, people who are hate mongers, until they are disincentivized from spreading hate or impeded from spreading hate, they're going to continue to do it, right? Like, people in
Our
politics,
silence speaks louder than the words. Sorry,
always
like
it does.
louder. So when you're actually silent, not saying anything, it
Yes,
seems as if you are
yes,
aligning yourself with them. And that is, as an outsider, that is how it is. You're
correct.
seeing such a hate spewed
Yes,
in such a
A-
manner continuously, and you're
and
silent.
not saying anything, not
and
saying
and you're not
anything.
saying anything, it means that you're aligning yourself with them, or to some extent that you're aligning yourself with them.
You're telling the
I
far
agree.
right that they can that like because people in politics, as you know, most of them will try to get away with what they think they can get away with. And if the far right continues to think that they can get away with spreading violently hateful rhetoric against Muslims or against any community, then they're going to continue to do it as long as they perceive it as being beneficial for their own political career. And until that is made, until that is no longer true, until they're disincentivized from that by other elected officials of conscience, they're going to continue to do it. Right? Because if this is happening in New York City, imagine what's happening in smaller towns and more center or right leaning places across the country. Like, this is unacceptable.
Yeah, definitely. And that is why I think, uh, and I said this multiple times to many of the guests, that one of the things I've noticed in the past years I've been involved in community work, one, that we are not proactive as a community, as a group of people. We are most of the time we are reactive. We wait until things to happen, and then we go with our plaques and we voice our opinion. Everything simmers down. We need to be a little bit more vibrant and be
Yes.
more proactive and organize programs. I'm not here to bash anyone. That's just my thought process, that while we recognize the issue, um, we have to find ways and means to actually combat this hate, or to somehow deal with matters like hate crime that we're seeing plaguing our society. And
Yes.
one of the reasons I invited you today is for us to discuss the growing concerns surrounding the hate crimes. And across our country, we have witnessed attack with people because of their religion, because of their race, because of their ethnicity, because of their nationality, and also
Mm-hmm.
because of their sexual orientation, and also their identity. Why do you believe, that hate crime basically continue to occur in our society today? That we've seen it, eh, up to, I'll say, like on the third or the fourth, the third of July, someone sneak into a mosque and
Mm-hmm.
try to somehow, harm the people at, at a very vulnerable time when Muslims are somehow offering congregational prayer. And
Yep.
this, while it's happening in a mosque at this particular time, that we're seeing somehow, it can happen in churches, in mandirs, the African American, they're also, subjected to this type of hate. Why do we continue to see this occurring today, despite of the efforts that are made
Right.
to counteract this?
I mean, so, I would argue that one of the main drivers of, the sort of spike in hate crimes that we're seeing against many different communities is related to the fact that we have a very vocal political class on the right that is
Mhm.
more than happy to indulge in sort of like scapegoating of various minority groups, to distract from their own lack of policies or their own failed policies, right? It is an undeniable fact that across the country, life is becoming more expensive. People are having a harder time, paying rent, let alone buying a home. People are having a harder time buying food. People are getting shut out of various aspects of the consumer economy just because they can't afford it, right? Like, even here in New York City, arguably like one of the better off places in the country, there's a lot of struggling. People are really struggling in this city. And so when you have this sort of right wing political ecosystem, and crucially a right wing sort of like media ecosystem that has,
Yeah,
a very wide reach, that's telling you, you're poor or you can't get a home because of immigrants, or you're poor or you can't get a job because some woman, got put in your place because of DEI, or,
yeah,
some black person or some LGBT person, right? Like that is what, so unfortunately, the mainstream Democratic Party largely has not spoken to the material needs of people in the United States for many decades, right? And I'm including, you know, someone who I voted for many times, Obama. Loved him. He was the first president I ever voted for, but he did not truly speak to the material concerns facing most Americans, right? Like it was this campaign of hope and joy, and that's great, but a lot of people were suffering in different parts of the country, and the Democratic Party wasn't going to really speak to those needs. So then, lo and behold, you have someone on the right in Trump, who did come along and was willing to speak to those needs, but what he provided was a fake solution. He didn't offer a material critique or like, economic theory. He said, "You're right. You're mad because you don't have access to these resources, and the reason that you don't have access to those resources is because these groups are coming in and taking them," right? Like that's like the whole, you're a real American, they're not, and so anyway, so that rhetoric, I would argue, that has gained so much traction in this country over the last decade is obviously going to have an effect on how people navigate like the real world, right? Like if you're someone who has been imbibed with this right-wing rhetoric around, oh, Muslims are, coming to do X, Y, and Z in the country, or LGBT people this, or like whatever it is, that can be for some people a radicalizing discourse. And we have
Yeah,
seen that many people on the right have become very radicalized over the last decade
yeah.
because this is the narrative that has been fed to them continuously by so many, people in our media, the punditocracy, and unfortunately, very influential and very loud people in our political establishment.
Thank you so much for your insight. I just want to move on with our discourse because I know the nature of your work and what you do and advocating for the LGBT community and other minority communities. I'm sure that you had experiences, your personal experiences. I don't know if you would like to share. Would love if you feel comfortable in share that. If you had any personal experience doing this work, because I know for a fact when you're in the forefront, that particular day we were there were a group of
Mm-hmm.
people that were in our faces were saying very
Mm,
unpleasant things
mm,
about us and also about the work that we do and about our religion, and there were no limitation of words of hate. Um, is there any experience basically in the years of your work that you would like to share? And I'm only asking if you're comfortable to share it because people will know that this work that we do, we're not doing it for fame or glory, that we're
right.
putting ourselves out there as harm as well, right?
Yes.
Um, the amount of hate that I get um, from my communities and other communities, you know, online because of the
Mm-hmm.
work that we do, sometimes you have to be silent. Sometimes you have to respond in a professional way,
Mm-hmm.
or not saying anything at all. But we expose ourselves by doing
Yes.
this work because we're hoping for a positive outcome of the work. It's easy
Yes.
for me to say this is not affecting me, but again, we cannot be self-centered. So, if you can share, would be really nice for viewers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, it is true. Like this work does come with its own kind of cost. Like, it's obviously something that I think you and I both find very rewarding, but it does come with its own cost, right? Like if you were to go to, my Instagram page, like, on some of the more recent videos, especially that are around sort of social justice issues, the comments are crazy, right? Like, like I have a very strong sort of like don't read comments on social justice posts, rule for myself because the commentary is pretty intense, right? Like,
Yeah.
I have been told in the line of the work that I do, to go back to, pick a country because they can't quite tell which country I'm supposed to come from. So it's supposed
That's
to go
it.
back to India. Sometimes it's Nigeria. Sometimes it's, Sri Lanka. Sometimes it's, they can't quite figure it out, right? So I, as someone who was born in this country, am frequently told to go back to places that I have visited maybe, but that I've never actually been, that I was never a citizen of, but it doesn't matter because, the point is I'm
Yeah.
not white. And that's what they're really talking about. They're saying, how dare you, this non-white person have an opinion? And the same thing as well. Like I'm also a member of the LGBT community. And so of course the same thing, there's plenty of discourse, it's quite negative that I've heard. And like, just like, I mean, just, anything that you can imagine, I have dealt with it. But I think that for me, what keeps me going is knowing that, I am descended from, from some parts of my family, from people who were brought to this country in shackles, right, as enslaved Africans and who were
Yeah.
forced to work here for however many centuries without pay, without anything. And for whatever reason, they could figure out a way to keep going. They could figure out a way to, even if they never saw freedom, it was, they had something within them to keep pushing forward for the next generation, for their community. And that that is true because I am here. And so if my own ancestors could, overcome the hurdles, the obstacles that were in their way, like when I think about that, that just gives me the strength to keep going. Cause it's like, yeah, like, it can be very a negative hearing certain commentary, but, you know, in our own bloodlines, how much negativity have our own ancestors gone through either in indenture or in slavery times, right? And like and yet they persisted. So if they can do it, so can we. And that's sort of like my philosophy.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That means a lot. I'm sure that our listeners were able to listen to your story as well, and take it as a motivation. And that's the only reason why we often share some of our experiences. When people hear the word hate crime, they often think only about physical violence, right?
Mm,
And but the impact goes much deeper. And let me take a moment and talk about the physical violence. It's heart wrenching. And imagine people have to live with that emotional trauma after experiencing physical violence because of hate crime.
mm,
Um, Today, I saw a post and actually shared it where a Muslim guy in one of the states was actually stabbed.
mm,
And when they caught the offender, he said, I stabbed the person because he mentioned that he was a Muslim. This individual is currently now in the hospital and battling for his life. That's physical violence, but I'm thinking
mhm,
about family members and people within that community, whether it's a Muslim community, whether it's the LGBT
mhm,
community, whether it is a minor, whatever African American community, when we experience hate crime, where it comes to someone's life is in danger, it also
mhm.
have a ripple effect, right? And that ripple effect
Absolutely.
is emotional issues, trauma, depression, fear, anxiety. All of that follows, and it goes on for years because when you come out of your home, you have to think whether someone will harm you, right? And
Absolutely.
can you help our audience to understand, maybe a little bit about emotional and psychological and the community-wide effect that hate crimes leave behind?
Absolutely.
Maybe a
I
little bit.
mean,
You can talk about it.
absolutely. I mean, so, the experience of violence, right? So, I think most people probably intuitively understand that, personally experiencing a hate crime or another form of, interpersonal violence, it will have a long-lasting effect on a person. Also, I think a lot of people probably understand the notion of vicarious trauma, i.e., oh, I saw this person experience this, or I heard this person I know experience this. That can also, of course, have an effect on people that I think, most people probably intuitively understand. But I think one of the effects of hate crimes that we don't often talk about is like, what does that do, as you were saying, to an entire community? And I
Uh-huh.
think that one of the most nefarious things that hate crimes can do to communities is they can condition the members of that community to expect little to nothing, to never, raise their heads, to not push back, right? Like, I would argue that, like, it's not just here in America, unfortunately, right? Like, if you look at so many different, like, minority groups that are, disenfranchised around the world, they like despondency is a thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
being checked out of the political process is a thing. Like, how many people do you and I know, right? So you're based out in Queens and I'm based over in East Harlem. And I would argue that even though those are two very different communities and different boroughs, you and I both probably know a whole lot of people who say, oh, there's no point in me, talking to this politician, or there's no point in me voting because nothing ever changes. And like, things just get worse and worse and
Quite
worse.
often we hear that.
That is a trauma response, right? Like that is a response to not only being ignored, as a community by our elected officials, but also to being mistreated, right? To being told that, you are less than, you are lucky to be here, right? Like how many, people do we know who are of immigrant backgrounds who are appalled at what is happening with ICE right now, but they wouldn't speak up even as citizens because they're like, no, if I speak up, then like, X, Y, and Z can happen. So I think that's really probably the most insidious effect of like, hate and hate crimes experienced by members of a certain community is that it conditions the other members of that community to expect crumbs at the very most. And that is a
Yeah,
dangerous place for any community to be. That is a very dangerous place.
yeah. I totally agree with what you're saying, and there are a few more things that I want us to discuss briefly. And you mentioned about social media and the platform um, used, to spew hate. And we know the social media has tremendous influences, right? And while we try to, while it helps to connect people, it can also spread a lot of misinformation and a lot of hatred, right?
Yes.
Um, I believe in the necessity of monitoring the social media, because while it has its benefit, it has its negative as well,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a role to play in terms of advocating, um,
Yes.
um, one, advocating that the platform used for the right reason. And I know it's a thin line when it comes to between hate crime and spewing words of hate and freedom of speech. I believe words do matter, and
Yes.
with a simple tweet, it could cause disruptions like we have seen before. So spreading misinformation cause or can somehow create that flame into a fire that causes a lot of harm. How do you see social media contributing to both the problem that we are facing, and also the solution we have, solution to
Yes.
the problem?
No, I mean, like 100%. And like, I will say this is someone who is on social media, but, not as deeply as maybe other members of my generation. So,
Yeah,
like, for example, I've never really been on Twitter. So my experiences are mostly limited to, Instagram and Facebook and things of that nature. But I think that for me, so I'll start off like by saying that I do believe that platforms have a responsibility to monitor content, like, not I mean, like, it's such a hard question, right? Because, like, I don't necessarily, like, believe in censorship because I don't trust these platforms to
yeah, of
censor in a
course.
way that's not gonna favor a particular, like, political ideology. Because I think they've been very clear in where their allegiances lie politically in the last couple years.
And that's why
So
we're talking about this too, because we know that the platform is used to, you know,
yes.
to put that gog
Yes.
basically, and also to silent
Yes.
many people, right? That's one.
Yes.
So there's a thin
Yes.
line between freedom of speech and also using the very platform
Yes.
for hate. And you're on point. Yes. Go
One
ahead.
hu 1000%, and so, like, I do believe that people should be able to sort of express themselves, on social media freely, like, within certain parameters, and, like, like, I do believe that hate speech should not be allowed. I think that there should be sort of, like, monitoring of what is said and sort of, like, working to sort of, like, um regulate sort of like the kinds of content that are permitted, right? Because if not, then I think that we've seen what happens, right? Like, platforms will devolve into what X is potentially, or into what, like, these, messaging boards like 4chan and whatnot, were or continue to be. And so I do think that there's a very fine balance to strike there. But I'll also say, just like in terms of the benefit, because I'm seeing now, right? Because as you've said, right, so many of the leaders of these platforms have been enthusiastically pro far right, pro Trump, pro, everything, anti-immigrant this, anti-LGBT, anti-D, like, all they've been so happy to like align themselves with those sort of like malicious actors that I think many people on the left have now had this sort of like pendulum, like where they're like, oh, well, we just need to sort of like, ban people from using social media, ban, teenagers, ban this, ban that. And like, I actually don't personally believe that. Like, I heard this wonderful anecdote. I believe it was from this writer, Cory Doctorow, who's from Toronto.
Yeah.
And he said, that when he was starting out in his activism back in the 90s in Canada, right, obviously it's very cold. And, he would use his bike to go plaster flyers on various buildings in the middle of winter, because that's what you did back in the 90s. There was no internet for most people. And he said, if the left chooses to abandon, or to essentially make social media inaccessible, what you're doing is that you are limiting your own reach, right? Like you're going to limit yourself to riding a bike in the winter, posting up flyers, while the far right is 1000% going to continue using these platforms, to scale up their messaging, right? Because the far right is not going to let go of this powerful tool. And I think it would be a huge mistake for those of us on the left to essentially leave this tool on the table and to not figure out a way to use it towards our more humane ends, right? So
Yeah.
that's sort of like my stance is that yes, it needs like regulation, but banning and blocking access, it's not. I don't think
It's
that's
not
a
going to
smart
help.
strategy.
Yeah.
No,
Uh,
no.
that's why we have to use it in a positive way. I
Yes.
feel we're living in a world today that rather than reading a book or people will choose to go and scroll on social media. So
Mhm.
it becomes a platform where we get our information from,
Yes.
and that fact is known. That's why a lot of people are getting all these fake news sometimes from that platform, and
Yes.
being influenced on the platform. So we have to counteract that with consistency in terms of what we post, and how do we really respond to some of that hate that we're seeing. I often will probably, as I said, my personal experience will be silent, but I ask myself as a community leader, is it right for me to be silent? And I've seen
Right.
myself shifted all the way from being silent to be that person that voice my opinion without
That's
fear, but I do it in a firm way, in a respectful way, so to speak.
right.
And I think
Right.
that's the way. And despite we have been talking about the challenges, right? Um, there's still hope for the future.
Yes.
Looking at some of the people that are actively involved in this work, and there is this driving force behind advocating for peace and harmony and togetherness, that there is hope, and we should not fall into despair. What gives you hope for the future in the work that you do?
Mm. I think so. Full transparency, I am a member and in leadership within the Democratic Socialists of America, the New York City chapter. And I think for me, I derive a lot of hope from just seeing, the amount of political acumen, smartness, shrewdness among the people I'm organizing with. Like, so I'm about 40 years old right now. But like a lot of people I'm organizing with are much younger. They're in their 20s and like, early 30s. And, to just see people who are so young, so focused and so smart, and just to have such a good an accurate understanding of power and how change happens. I love seeing that. I derive so much inspiration from that because I'm like, oh, finally, right? Because DSA 20 years ago just didn't have the same level of prominence in my generation when we were in our 20s. But now seeing these younger people who are not just talking the way that we talked in our 20s, but they're really, focused on creating change, at the city, state, and, into the federal level. That is so inspirational. And I am just, it gives me no shortage of inspiration seeing them because they all deal with a lot of things too. A lot of the people I organize with, they deal with a whole lot of things, and they're also balancing work and family and their political work, and they don't give up. And to see young people so focused gives me a whole lot of hope because they are the future, right? And it's I'm just honored and inspired to be able to organize with them.
And that's good. Like this uh, this group of youngsters that we're seeing and we're so proud of. They were
Hmm.
very evident during the campaign of our current mayor, and even after that. I think one of the strong messages that came out of that we can, with collaboration and with hard work and with conviction, keyword conviction, that a lot of things can happen, that we should not give up, so to speak, despite
That's right.
where we're at in terms
That's
of the
right.
situation. That I think that there's a light ahead of us, and seeing the young dynamic group, advocating and banding together, seeing themselves as a link in a chain together, holding tight, holding together. I think That's a positive way of that I look at it. That the young people, it's a beam of light,
Yes.
and as long as they have that zeal and that zest and that courageousness, I think we will hopefully have a bright future and change can happen. Before we conclude, I would like to leave our audience with uh, with one final question. If every listener could remember just one message, right, from our conversation today, what will that message be? If you don't
Mm,
mind sharing.
just one
Sorry I
message.
put you like that. It's okay. Take a moment and think about it because your voice is powerful, and knowing your story again, I know you're Hindu by faith. You're I think one of your parents is from the Caribbean and coming from a diverse group. And doing the work that you're doing, it's an inspiration, frankly speaking. That's why I ask you as a young person, 40, to be here. I want the young voices to be on the platform, and I'm sure your voice will be an inspiration for many people that are actually in their shells, so to speak, and are
Yes.
fearful to come out because they feel that there's no hope, they're scared. So that I'll ask you if you can share that would be really nice.
Absolutely. So something to take away. So I would say if you ever in your life see a person with a lot of money or power telling you that everything going wrong in your life is because of a group or person that does not have power or money, be skeptical.
So,
Think twice. Maybe ask yourself, knowing the way that our society works, if money and power tend to be, the root cause of so much of our culture, tend to be the drivers of our culture, and this person with both of those assets is telling me to blame everything wrong in my life on a relatively disenfranchised group or person, I don't know. Maybe question that premise because I think that's at the root of a lot of what we're seeing now politically is people believing that those without power are somehow the ones that they need to express their frustrations with or their vitriol towards. And I would argue that that's very rarely the case.
right. So, thank you so much for sharing your insight and for, finding time to be on the podcast. Your experience and your commitment to building stronger communities, safer and more inclusive, we really appreciate that and appreciate your time that you're spending with us. To our listeners, remember that hate never defeats by silence. We must able to speak and not to be silent. It can overcome through education as well. So we have a role to play in not only speaking about it, but also to educate our children. If you're a religious leader, ensure that these are subject area that you speak about in your mosque, in your churches, in your mandirs, and also in your synagogues about the importance of love and the importance of harmony. Speak against the hate crime that we're seeing. If it means that you have to uh, call out politicians in the most respectful manner, in a most form and respectful manner, you can do that within the perimeter of your place of worship. So, through education, compassion, courage, and meaningful relationship, every one of us has the ability to build bridges, not to build walls that we're seeing that they're trying to build walls to divide us based on our color, and based on the differences that we have. And I always share and remind you all of the Quranic verse that I often will share in gatherings, and I remind myself about it. And I think that has been a driving force for the work that I do. That God, He says, "O mankind, I created you from a male and female and made you into nations and tribes."
Mm,
So that we may able to know each other. And I said that this verse is talking about, while it explicitly talks about nations and tribes, that there's a subtle message there. He created us differently. He created us with different thought process. We make different choices, different practice, different, you know, subhanallah, I'll say different religious belief, conviction, different thought process. S- but with that difference it's a demonstration of our strength, so they're able to know each other and basically interact with each other, knowing each other, not to build walls based on those differences, but rather to build bridges, stronger bridges, safer. And therefore, I want to say that we have an obligation to reject prejudice and contribute to a more peaceful society, especially for ourselves and for our future generation. Thank you all for joining us on SB Life Institute, our podcast. Until next time, uh, continue sharing our message. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We appreciate if you can kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and also share it with your families and friends. Peace and love. Um, until next time.